To family, Isabel said as she lifted her wine glass beneath the chandelier, her voice smooth and elegant enough to fool anyone who didn't know her well. And to loyalty. Everyone at the table raised their glasses except Harrison. He remained seated at the far end of the massive oak table, one rough hand resting beside a sealed brown envelope, while rain tapped softly against the tall dining room windows. Nobody noticed at first, or maybe they pretended not to. In families like ours, silence had always been more dangerous than shouting. The old dining room inside the Ashford estate looked exactly the way it had when I was a child. Dark wood walls, oil paintings older than anyone still alive, a stone fireplace glowing quietly beneath portraits of dead men who built fortunes nobody in this room deserved. The chandelier cast soft golden light across crystal glasses and silver cutlery, but the warmth never reached anyone's face. Isabel sat beside David like she belonged there more than the family itself. Her long blonde hair rested perfectly against the shoulders of her ivory dress while she poured wine with calm, practiced movements. She always looked composed during moments when other people felt uncomfortable, especially during lies. David barely touched his food. His tie hung loose beneath the collar of his dark suit, exhaustion carved into his face deeper than the lines around Harrison's eyes. Across from them, Victoria sat perfectly upright, fingers wrapped around her glass, as if posture alone could preserve control over this family. Eleanor remained quiet beneath the chandelier, cardigan folded carefully around her shoulders, avoiding eye contact the same way she had for years. Only Ethan looked nervous enough to be honest. He kept glancing toward Harrison, toward the envelope resting near his hand, toward the strange stillness that seemed to follow him tonight. Most people underestimated Harrison because they confused silence with weakness. They saw the faded denim jacket, the uncombed silver hair, the tired face weathered by years of distance from the family business, and they decided he didn't matter. Isabel believed that most of all. She once called him harmless during a Christmas dinner when she thought nobody could hear her. But James heard. The old family butler heard everything. He stood near the staircase now, motionless with a silver serving tray in his hands, watching the room carefully without saying a word. Then Thomas arrived. The family lawyer stepped inside, carrying rainwater on the shoulders of his charcoal coat, his leather briefcase hanging heavily at his side. The entire room changed the moment he entered. David stopped breathing for a second. Eleanor lowered her eyes. Isabel's smile froze almost invisibly around the edges. And Harrison finally looked up from the envelope resting beside his hand. That was the moment I realized my grandfather wasn't afraid anymore. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Thomas entered the dining room. The grandfather clock near the staircase filled the silence with slow mechanical clicks while rainwater slid down the tall windows overlooking the dark Ashford property. Harrison remained seated at the end of the table, his expression unreadable beneath the soft amber light of the chandelier. Ethan noticed something strange then. Thomas did not look at David first. He did not greet Victoria. He did not acknowledge Isabel standing beside the wine cart with her careful smile frozen in place. Instead, the old lawyer looked directly at Harrison as if the two men had already been having a conversation long before tonight began. Traffic was terrible, Thomas finally said as he removed his gloves. His voice sounded calm, but his eyes moved carefully around the room the way people look around churches during funerals. James stepped forward immediately to take his coat, but Thomas kept one hand firmly wrapped around the leather briefcase hanging at his side. Isabel recovered first. She always did. "Thomas," she said warmly, though her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her wine glass. "You were just in time for dessert." Harrison almost smiled at that. Ethan saw it happen for less than a second before the old man leaned back in his chair again, rough hands folded quietly across his lap. Most people in the family thought Harrison had spent his entire life drifting from one failure to another. David used to joke that his older brother could ruin a $1 million opportunity wearing work boots and smelling like gasoline. Victoria hated when Harrison attended family dinners because he refused to pretend. He never wore tailored suits, never discussed investments, never fought for attention. He simply watched everyone else exhaust themselves trying to maintain appearances. But Ethan remembered something his grandmother Eleanor once whispered after too much wine during Thanksgiving 3 years earlier. "Your Uncle Harrison notices everything." she had said softly while staring into the fireplace. That is why this family never trusted him. At the time, Ethan thought she was confused. Now he was not so sure. Isabel walked around the table, slowly refilling glasses no one had finished. Her perfume lingered softly in the room, expensive and subtle, carefully chosen like every other detail about her. She stopped beside Harrison last. "Wine?" she asked politely. Harrison looked at her for a long moment before glancing toward the brown envelope resting near his plate. "No thank you," he said quietly. "I would rather keep a clear head tonight." The temperature in the room seemed to drop after that. David finally looked up from his untouched dinner plate, exhaustion dark beneath his eyes. "What exactly is this about, Thomas?" he asked. The lawyer loosened his tie slowly before setting the leather briefcase on the dining table between the candlelight and crystal glasses. "Your father asked me to wait until the right moment," Thomas replied carefully. "And I believe that moment the fire cracked softly inside the stone fireplace, but nobody in the dining room looked warm anymore." Thomas opened the brass locks on his leather briefcase with slow, deliberate movements, while Isabel returned carefully to her seat beside David. Ethan noticed she no longer touched her wine glass. Her attention remained fixed on the documents inside the briefcase as though she already knew what they contained. Harrison remained perfectly still at the end of the long oak table, shoulders relaxed beneath his worn denim jacket, silver hair uneven beneath the chandelier light. He looked less like a member of the Ashford family than one of the mechanics who repaired the estate gates during winter storms. That was exactly how Victoria preferred it. "Your father left very specific instructions," Thomas said quietly as he removed a thick manila folder. He believed certain matters should only be discussed once everyone involved revealed their true loyalties. David let out a tired breath and rubbed his forehead. "This is about the trust, is it not?" he asked. "Because if this is another delay regarding the restructuring, I really do not have the energy tonight." "It is not about restructuring," Thomas replied. "It is about ownership." Nobody moved after that word. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. Ethan looked toward Eleanor and saw her fingers trembling faintly against the edge of her napkin. She kept staring at the chandelier instead of the table, as if eye contact itself had become dangerous. Ethan had noticed that behavior for months now. Every family dinner followed the same strange rhythm. Isabel controlled conversations before they became uncomfortable. Victoria corrected anyone who challenged her. David looked exhausted before the first course even arrived. And Eleanor remained silent through all of it, like someone guarding a secret too heavy to carry anymore. But Harrison was different tonight. He was watching everyone instead of hiding from them. Ethan realized then that his grandfather had already seen this moment coming long before anyone else. "Perhaps this conversation can wait until tomorrow," Isabel suggested smoothly. "Everyone is tired and emotional." Thomas ignored her completely. "The trust your father created 26 years ago contains conditions that were never disclosed publicly," he continued, "including conditions related to succession." David straightened immediately. Victoria narrowed her eyes. Isabel's calm expression shifted almost invisibly around the mouth before she recovered again. Ethan felt the pressure in the room building slowly, like a storm trapped inside the walls of the old estate. Then Harrison finally spoke. "Tell them about the letters," he said quietly. Thomas looked at him for a long second before nodding once. "There were letters your father wrote shortly before his death," the lawyer admitted. "Letters meant to remain sealed until I believed the family was ready to hear the truth." Eleanor closed her eyes immediately after those words. And for the first time all evening, Isabel looked afraid. Nobody asked Thomas to continue, but nobody stopped him either. The old lawyer removed a smaller envelope from the folder and placed it carefully beside the untouched dessert plates. Ethan noticed the paper looked yellowed with age, the edges slightly worn as if someone had opened it many times before deciding to seal it again. Harrison stared at the envelope without expression while Isabel folded her hands together in her lap, so tightly the knuckles turned pale beneath the chandelier light. "Your father wrote these letters during the final months of his illness," Thomas said quietly. He became concerned about certain decisions being made inside the family after his condition worsened. David looked confused more than angry. "Concerned about what exactly?" he asked. Thomas hesitated before answering. "About who was truly loyal to him, and who was loyal only to the Ashford name." The fireplace crackled softly again. Ethan could hear rain moving through the gutters outside the mansion, while somewhere deeper in the house an old pipe groaned behind the walls. The Ashford estate always sounded alive at night. Harrison used to tell Ethan that old houses learned how to keep secrets better than people did. At the time, Ethan thought it was only another strange thing his grandfather said after too much whiskey on the back porch. Now the words felt different, more like a warning. Victoria suddenly pushed her chair back slightly. "This is becoming unnecessary," she said sharply. "Richard is gone. We all cared for him in our own way. Digging through old letters will solve nothing." Harrison looked toward her for the first time that evening. "That depends on what the letters say," he replied calmly. Victoria did not answer. She simply looked away toward the windows where rainwater distorted the darkness beyond. The glass. Ethan noticed James standing near the dining room entrance again, silent as always, though his attention never drifted far from Thomas and the folder resting on the table. It occurred to Ethan then that James did not seem surprised by any of this, almost as if he had been waiting for the same moment Harrison had. Isabel finally leaned forward, voice smooth and measured once more. "Thomas," she said carefully, "surely Richard did not intend for private family matters to become public spectacle." "No," Thomas answered. "He intended for the truth to survive long enough to be heard." Nobody moved after that sentence. Eleanor lowered her face into trembling hands while David stared at the folder with growing unease. Ethan could almost see the balance inside the room shifting slowly away from Isabel for the first time in years. Then Thomas opened the envelope and removed a folded handwritten letter. Harrison closed his eyes briefly as though he already knew every word written on the page. "This letter," Thomas said quietly, "was addressed specifically to Harrison." Isabel stopped breathing for just a second. Ethan saw it happen, and that was when he realized his grandfather had never been sitting quietly at the end of the table because he was powerless. He had been waiting. Thomas unfolded the letter carefully beneath the chandelier light, while nobody at the table dared interrupt him. The paper crackled softly in his hands, fragile with age but preserved with deliberate care. Harrison remained motionless at the end of the oak table, though Ethan noticed his jaw tighten slightly for the first time all evening. Isabel leaned back in her chair with practiced calm, but her fingers no longer rested steadily against her wine glass. David looked from Thomas to Harrison with growing confusion, exhaustion slowly giving way to suspicion. "This letter was written 6 weeks before Richard Ashford passed away," Thomas said quietly. "He instructed me to deliver it only if the integrity of the family became compromised." Victoria let out a quiet breath through her nose. "Richard always dramatized things near the end," she muttered. Harrison ignored her completely. Thomas began reading. "If you are hearing this letter now, Harrison, then it means the family has become exactly what I feared it would become. A house built on appearances instead of truth." The room became still again. Even the fireplace seemed quieter. Ethan watched Eleanor lower her eyes immediately after hearing Richard's words spoken aloud. She looked older tonight than he had ever seen her, shoulders folded inward beneath the pale cardigan she always wore during family dinners. Thomas continued, "You once told me silence could protect people longer than honesty could. I pray you were right. But if things have reached this point, then you must finally tell them what I could not." David frowned deeply. "Tell us what?" he asked. Nobody answered him. Isabel spoke before Thomas could continue. "This is ridiculous," she said softly. "Richard was heavily medicated near the end of his illness. We all know grief affected his judgment." Ethan looked toward Harrison then, expecting anger, but his grandfather only stared quietly at the rain sliding down the windows beyond the dining room. "Keep reading," Harrison said calmly. Thomas nodded once. "There are things about this family your mother never had the strength to admit. There are truths hidden behind loyalty, inheritance, and reputation. Harrison knows all of them because I trusted him to protect what remained of this family after I was gone." Victoria suddenly stood from her chair. "Enough," she snapped sharply. "This conversation is over." But nobody moved, not even James near the doorway. Ethan realized something unsettling in that moment. Victoria was used to controlling every room she entered, yet tonight her voice carried something unfamiliar beneath the anger. Fear. Isabel noticed it too. Ethan saw her glance quickly toward Victoria before recovering her composure again. David looked completely lost now, his hands pressed flat against the tablecloth as though trying to steady himself. "What truths?" he asked quietly. "What exactly are we talking about?" Thomas slowly lowered the letter and looked directly at Eleanor. The old woman closed her eyes before he even spoke. "We are talking," Thomas said, carefully, "about why Richard changed the succession structure of the Ashford Trust 20 years ago." No one reacted immediately after Thomas mentioned the trust. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside the estate. Ethan could hear rain striking the tall windows behind the dining room curtains, while the grandfather clock near the staircase continued its slow, steady ticking. Harrison leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes fixed on the fireplace instead of the people around him. It was the posture of someone who had already survived this conversation years ago. David finally broke the silence first. "What did my father change?" he asked quietly. Thomas removed another document from the folder before answering. Richard amended the Ashford succession structure after discovering information he believed could destroy the family if it became public. Isabel immediately looked toward Eleanor. It lasted less than a second, but Ethan saw it clearly. Fear. Real fear this time. Eleanor's trembling hands remained folded tightly in her lap, while her eyes stayed fixed on the tablecloth. "Mother," David said slowly, confusion darkening his face. "What is he talking about?" Victoria answered before Eleanor could speak. "Your father became paranoid near the end," she said sharply. "He spent too much time listening to rumors and regrets." Harrison let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like disappointment. "That is not true," he said calmly. The room froze again. Ethan realized then that everyone at the table reacted differently whenever Harrison spoke. Isabel became cautious. Victoria became defensive. Eleanor looked ashamed. And David looked frightened without understanding why. Thomas opened the second document carefully. The amendment states that full control of the Ashford Trust would only transfer after verification of direct lineage and disclosure of concealed family records. David frowned immediately. "Verification of lineage?" he repeated. "What does that even mean?" Nobody answered him right away. Ethan looked toward James near the doorway and noticed the old butler lower his eyes quietly, as if he had spent years carrying knowledge he was never allowed to discuss. Isabel suddenly stood from her chair, movements graceful despite the tension tightening her face. "This has gone far enough," she said evenly. "David does not need to sit here listening to cryptic accusations during dinner." "These are not accusations," Thomas replied quietly. "They are instructions left by Richard Ashford himself." Isabel looked toward Harrison then. "And you knew about this?" she asked softly. Harrison finally turned his attention toward her fully. "I knew enough to stay quiet," he answered. "Your mistake was assuming silence meant ignorance." Ethan felt a chill move through the room after those words. Even Victoria stopped speaking. Thomas reached into the folder one final time and removed a sealed envelope marked with a faded date from 20 years earlier. "There is one more document," he said carefully. "Richard instructed me to open it only if someone attempted to control the succession process before the truth became public." David stared at the envelope with visible confusion while Eleanor quietly began to cry beside the chandelier light. And for the first time all night, Isabel looked completely unprepared for what came next. Thomas held the sealed envelope in both hands for several long seconds before opening it. Nobody at the table tried to stop him anymore. Whatever control Isabel and Victoria once carried inside the Ashford estate had begun slipping away the moment Richard's letters entered the room. Ethan could feel it in the silence itself. The old mansion no longer felt like a place protecting secrets. It felt like a place preparing to release them. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows beside the fireplace, while candlelight flickered softly across the portraits lining the dark walls. Harrison remained seated at the far end of the oak table, calm and unreadable beneath the chandelier. Ethan could not understand how one man could sit so quietly while everyone else around him seemed to be unraveling. Thomas finally broke the seal. Inside the envelope rested several folded documents along with a faded photograph. He stared at the contents for a moment before slowly placing the photograph on the table. David leaned forward immediately. "What is that?" he asked. Nobody answered him right away. Ethan could only see part of the image from where he sat, but it showed two young men standing beside an old pickup truck near a lake house many years earlier. One of them was clearly Richard Ashford in his 40s. The other looked painfully familiar. Harrison, only younger, cleaner, smiling in a way Ethan had never seen before. This photograph was taken the summer before Richard amended the trust, Thomas explained quietly. At the time, he had already learned information that changed how he viewed the future of this family. Isabel folded her arms tightly. Enough with the dramatic language, she said coldly. Either say what you are implying or stop wasting everyone's time. Thomas looked directly at her then. Richard discovered that certain family records had been altered, he replied, including records connected to inheritance and biological lineage. David stared at him blankly. Biological lineage, he repeated slowly. You keep saying that. What does it mean? Eleanor suddenly covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Ethan realized she had been crying silently for several minutes now. Victoria noticed it too. Pull yourself together, she snapped under her breath. Harrison looked toward Eleanor with something softer than anger in his eyes. Pity, perhaps, or exhaustion. She tried to tell him years ago, Harrison said quietly. Every head turned toward him. It was the first time all evening he had volunteered information instead of responding to it. Tell who? David asked immediately. Harrison met his gaze calmly across the long dining table. Your father, he answered. About what this family really became after the business money arrived. The room felt colder after that sentence. Ethan saw Isabel glance quickly toward the staircase where James still stood silently, holding the silver serving tray. She looked trapped now, though she tried desperately not to show it. Thomas slowly opened the final document inside the envelope and adjusted his glasses before speaking again. Richard requested DNA verification for all direct heirs before control of the estate could legally transfer, he said carefully. David's face drained of color, and for the first time all night, nobody looked at Harrison like he was powerless anymore. The words settled over the dining room like cold smoke. DNA verification, direct heirs, succession control. Ethan looked around the massive oak table and realized nobody was breathing normally anymore. The storm outside the Ashford estate had grown heavier, rain striking the windows hard enough to blur the dark grounds beyond the glass. Candlelight trembled softly beneath the chandelier, while shadows shifted across the old portraits hanging above the fireplace. Harrison remained seated exactly where he had been all night, calm and silent at the far end of the table, while the rest of the family struggled to absorb what Thomas had just revealed. David stood abruptly from his chair. Are you telling me my father questioned whether I was his son? He asked, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. No, Thomas answered carefully. Richard questioned whether everyone around him was telling the truth. Isabel stepped closer to David immediately, one hand resting gently against his arm. You do not need to listen to this, she said softly. This entire situation is cruel and unnecessary. Harrison looked at her then with an expression Ethan could not fully understand. It was not anger. It was recognition, as if he had been watching the same performance for decades. You always knew how to calm people before they started asking questions, he said quietly. Isabel's face hardened almost invisibly. What is that supposed to mean? She asked. Harrison did not answer immediately. He reached instead toward the old brown envelope beside his plate and slowly slid it across the table toward Thomas. Show them the records, he said. Victoria stood up, so suddenly her chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor. Absolutely not, she snapped. This family has suffered enough humiliation already. Humiliation only exists once the truth becomes visible, Harrison replied calmly. Ethan felt chills move through him after hearing those words. The room no longer felt like a family dinner. It felt like years of hidden fear finally collapsing under its own weight. Thomas opened the envelope Harrison had given him and removed several age documents along with a small velvet jewelry box. Eleanor immediately covered her face with trembling hands the moment she saw it. David looked between them helplessly. Somebody tell me what is happening, he said quietly. James finally moved from the doorway for the first time all evening. The old butler approached slowly and placed a crystal tumbler of water beside Eleanor without speaking. Ethan noticed the deep sadness in his eyes. This was not new to him. He had known, maybe all along. Thomas opened the velvet box carefully and removed an old gold signet ring engraved with the original Ashford family crest. Richard intended this ring to pass only to the person he believed protected the family instead of controlling it, Thomas explained softly. David stared at the ring in confusion. That was supposed to come to me, he whispered. Harrison finally looked directly at him across the long table. That is what everyone assumed, he said quietly, including the people who spent years making sure you never questioned anything. Isabel slowly stepped away from David after that, and for the first time since the dinner began, Ethan realized she no longer looked confident. She looked cornered. Nobody touched the dessert that night. The candles burned lower across the massive dining table, while the storm slowly weakened beyond the tall estate windows. Somewhere upstairs, old pipes groaned softly through the walls of the Ashford mansion, but inside the dining room the silence felt heavier than any sound. David remained standing beside his chair, staring at the gold signet ring resting near Thomas's hand, as though the entire shape of his life had shifted in front of him. Isabel no longer stood close to him. She had moved toward the fireplace sometime during the last few minutes, her posture still elegant but no longer controlled. Ethan noticed she kept watching Harrison now instead of the documents. The balance inside the room had changed completely. Victoria lowered herself back into her chair slowly, the sharp certainty that once defined her expression replaced by exhaustion. Eleanor sat quietly beside her with tears drying against her face, hands wrapped around the untouched glass of water James had brought her earlier. Nobody blamed Harrison aloud for what was happening, but Ethan realized something important then. They had all spent years treating him like an outsider because it made the rest of them feel safer. A quiet man at the end of the table was easy to ignore, easy to underestimate. Harrison finally stood for the first time that evening. The movement alone changed the atmosphere inside the room. He looked older beneath the chandelier light than Ethan had ever noticed before. Not weak, just tired, like someone who had carried a truth far longer than he ever wanted to. He walked slowly toward the fireplace, where Isabel stood waiting silently. "Did you know?" she asked him quietly without looking away. Harrison stared into the fire for several seconds before answering. "I knew enough," he said. "Your mistake was believing this family would stay buried under appearances forever." Isabel swallowed hard after hearing that. For the first time all night, Ethan saw genuine emotion break through her carefully polished composure. Not anger, regret, or perhaps fear of finally being seen clearly. Thomas closed the folder and removed his glasses slowly. "The legal review of the succession process begins Monday morning," he said carefully. "Until then, no transfers of estate authority can proceed." David lowered himself back into his chair heavily, eyes fixed on the tablecloth in front of him. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly. Harrison looked around the room one final time before answering. The chandelier light reflected softly against old family portraits while rainwater continued sliding down the windows overlooking the dark property outside. "Now," Harrison said calmly, "everybody stops pretending." Nobody argued with him after that. Ethan watched his grandfather walk slowly toward the doorway beside the staircase, while James stepped aside respectfully to let him pass. For years, the entire family feared power, money, inheritance, reputation. But sitting in that quiet dining room beneath the fading candlelight, Ethan finally understood the truth nobody else had seen until it was too late. The most dangerous person in the Ashford family had never been the loudest one in the room. It had been the man who sat silently at the end of the table waiting for the truth to survive long enough to reveal itself.